Hello, everyone, and welcome to Social 20. So, what we're going to be learning about this year is really the theme of nationalism. So, in grade 10, you learned about globalization. In grade 11, you're going to learn about nationalism. And then in grade 12, social studies, you learn about ideologies. So, what we're going to explore today in this lesson is really what is nationalism. We're going to look at some different perspectives on nationalism. We're going to explore different definitions. And then we're going to come away with a feeling about what we think the basics of nationalism include. These are our lesson objectives for today. So to start with, we need to understand what nationalism has become and the importance of nationalism in society. Nationalism is a slightly different concept than, let's say, patriotism. And the reason that we look at nationalism is it has shaped societies and movements in large ways over time. It has become a real issue lately. It has resurged with how important it is to pursue our own sense of goals and interest as a country, or how do we participate with others. So when we think about nationalism, we need to understand the importance of how it has shaped both history and society today. So when we start to look at a few different definitions for nationalism, the Oxford Canadian Dictionary states that nationalism is a patriotic feeling or principles. It defines it as an extreme form of patriotic feelings and principles and a policy of national independence. If we look to a different perspective, George Orwell is a very famous author who has written some novels, and you're going to speak more about him in Social 30, who has identified the state and power as something that should be very limited with a country. So he talks about nationalism as the habit of identifying oneself with a single nation or other unit. The abiding purpose of every nationalist is to secure more power and more prestige for the nation or other unit in which he has chosen to sink his own individuality. You can see he has quite a negative take towards nationalism, and we're going to start to understand how some people view it before we properly define it. Some other people have said that nationalism, for example, Ernest Gellner in Nations and Nationalism, this is in 1983, so the world was not as globalized back then. He says it is a political principle which holds that the political and the national unit should be congruent, they should match. We don't necessarily associate nationalism with politics, but that is one person's take on it. Albert Einstein, of course, you might have heard this before, has said that nationalism is an infantile sickness. It is the measles of the human race. He saw it as a very negative connotation and did not have positive feelings towards nationalism. The last one we'll look at is George William Curtis, who said, "A man's country is not a certain area of land, of mountains, rivers, and woods, but it is a principle, and patriotism is loyalty to that principle." That's closer to how we view nationalism today. He says it's more about a feeling and the idea and the belief as opposed to a certain area. So it is very hard to define exactly what nationalism is. There is a good definition in your textbook that's worth looking at, but what we do know for sure, a definition of nationalism must include these two main objectives. It must include the devotion to the interests of cultures of one's nation. So it has to include a sense of patriotism, of a pull towards a country, and an interest in that nation's goals. So we also look at the emphasis on national goals rather than the individual. So nationalism must include those two things. It has to have a sense of national goals and the pursuit of that. And when we look throughout history, we see that perhaps at times the pursuit of national goals has led to conflict. For example, World War I and World War II. And recently, we've seen a resurgence in Trump, who took presidency of the United States, who wanted to kind of define the United States more by a sense of nationalism and the national goal of isolationism, as not doing as much business with others and making their country a bit more self-sufficient. So nationalism has repeated its sense of importance throughout history, and it has always included these two things: a devotion to the interests of one's nation and an emphasis on national goals. So when we think about something like patriotism, we think about it as more the display of nationalism. So the waving of the flags and painting the face with perhaps maple leaves on Canada Day, that is a display of devotion. But nationalism is ultimately that feeling that you would maybe sacrifice something individually for your nation and to pursue your national goals. So when we're looking at all of the different views on nationalism, some people are going to view it very positively. Some people are going to view it negatively. We have seen the context for nationalism change throughout history. And of course, it's going to depend on a person's personal experiences. So we are all going to have a different perspective. We might have been born in a different place and we moved to a place that has, provided different opportunities, and we have different feelings and experiences. And so when we are looking at why somebody would view nationalism in a certain way, we need to understand the context. The context just means why would they have that worldview? So they have different beliefs and opinions, and it's important for us to understand. Sometimes we don't always know the full picture. So that's important to understand when we're reading news or media articles, or we're looking at people's opinions towards subjects. It's important to know sometimes we don't know all of the information. And it's up to us oftentimes to explore different perspectives on that before we make our own decision. This is a really interesting picture. So we see this picture, we can assume it's in a soccer match, but we're not too sure. I mean, the guy in green almost looks like he has a little bit more of a smile, and the guy in the red has a sense of agony. But when we look at the bigger picture, we see actually it's quite the opposite. And this is oftentimes something that is a theme, especially in social studies, that, we have different perspectives, but if we're not looking at everything through a perspective of a lot of different facets, that we just get a very limited view. And so it's up to us to really look into different perspectives. And that's a really important part about social studies. So as we talked about, there are several points of view towards nationalism. It doesn't change the definition, which includes a devotion to one's country and the pursuit of national goals. But we do need to understand some people don't view that very positively, and some people view it very negatively. And when we look at countries who don't really have much of a sense of cooperation amongst others, they have a view towards nationalism that's just different. And that is, isolationism, or somewhere like North Korea. So some opinions are very positive, some are very negative. So most of us can agree, whether you have a positive view towards nationalism or a negative view, that it is an active force in our society. And it is something that we need to really understand and to learn about. We need to know, what should the limits on nationalism be? Should it be a situation where we pursue our goals at any cost? And we've seen that in history when we look at World War II and the Holocaust. And we're going to look at examples of what happens when nationalism goes really far. And then we're also going to explore, well, at what point do we also have to make the decision that we have to work alongside other countries? But then that means giving up some sense of our nationalism and giving up some of our goals. So we need to understand, and that's what we're really looking at throughout the course. You're going to look at 4 big questions. So those are the units for Social 20. So you're going to start to look at, to what extent should nation be the foundation of identity? How important is that in our sense of who we are? To what extent should national interest be pursued? We're going to be looking at situations and times in history, mainly World War I, World War II, where the pursuit of national goals was really above all else. And then we're going to start to explore in Unit 3, to what extent should internationalism be pursued, which is on the other side. Now we need to understand, how important is it that we work together as countries? Should we give up our sovereignty, which means our independence, to work with other countries? Or should we limit it and let everybody else figure themselves out? So what's the importance of that? And where's the limits? Where do we stop? And that's something that's really not clearly answered, and it's something that we need to explore. The last unit is really focused on Canada's national identity. So we're going to look at things that are very specific to Canadian nationalism. So those are your 4 big units this course. So one of the last things to do as we learn about the definition of nationalism and kind of end this lesson is to think about the term nationalism in your own words. So if someone were to ask you, what is nationalism, or what are you studying in social, and you say nationalism, how would you define it? Take a moment to really put that into your own words, write down a definition, and be sure to look up the definition of nationalism in your textbook to help you. See you next time.
If you enjoyed this video, check out our website online.plrd.ab.ca and visit us on Facebook, Prairieland Online Academy. You can find out all that's going on with Prairieland Online Academy.